This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by journalist and author Nancy Matsumoto to discuss her new book, Reaping What She Sows, an exploration of the women transforming our broken food system from the ground up. We talk about what an alternative food system really looks like, why women are at the forefront of this movement, and how they're reimagining the way we grow, distribute and consume food, and offering a more just, sustainable and human-centric future.
I have been a professional writer my whole career. I studied English literature in college, but always knew I wanted to write and be a journalist. So I started just doing very general, beat reporter, City Hall, covering communities. I worked in Boston and Tokyo and Los Angeles. I fell into Newsweekly magazines because those were very big at the time. And I wrote for Newsweek and Time and the Time Inc. News Bureau, worked for People magazine for a number of years, but really just gravitated towards the things that I'm very interested in, which are food and food sovereignty, agriculture. I was a food and drinks writer for a long time, but just felt that it wasn't a complete picture. I really cared about the equity piece and how people are fed and how our food is grown and produced. So really led me to this topic very naturally. And I've been writing about agroecology, ecosystems, and food production for a long time now.
Yeah, and you've got a book out called Reaping What She Sows. You look at the alt food system and in particular women working in that space. So can you just give us a little bit of background about the book?
Yeah, I really wanted to showcase and tell the story of women who are at the forefront of food systems change and who are building what I call the alternative or alt food system, which is a short supply chain, very transparent and direct. And I wanted to show it in each chapter of the book in direct contrast to the big agriculture, big food system that all of us exist in, but maybe don't really think about it, don't really realize it because it is just the air that we breathe. And showing how these women are doing the very hard work of either building short regional supply chains from the ground up, or in many cases, re-regionalizing a food system that used to be very short and community-based regional, but with the increasing corporate consolidation of agribusiness, so many of these small producers were driven out of business, and we get these bigger and bigger conglomerates running our food system. So these women are trying to wrest control back and rebuild these local and regional food systems. It's very hard work, but I think really a passion, and they're driven by a passion for the land, for their animals, and for ecosystems restoration.
As we say, you focus on women. Is that because they're disproportionately represented in this space, or did you just want to highlight them because maybe they go sometimes a little bit unsung?
Yeah, I think both. I think they are absolutely disproportionately represented. Not to say that men aren't doing wonderful work in regenerating land and ecosystems, but in my long reporting, I feel like it's a predominantly women-led movement. And I think there are many reasons. I mean, like any other sector of the economy, men make more than women in agriculture. Women are less likely to be inheriting land or have access to agricultural education, the loans and the subsidies. So they tend to be working on the peripheries or the margins of our food systems, and they are less invested in sort of holding on to the status quo. They see that change has to be made, and usually it is on the margins and on the periphery where radical change is happening. And really every person that I spoke to in my book said, yes, it's women who are driving this movement forward in our sector of the food system. I guess it's both in answer to your question.
And I think I probably assume that a lot of people know what the problems are associated with those large and complicated supply chains. But in case they're not aware, can you outline some of the inherent problems with the existing system?
Yeah, I think the main difference to think about is that this is these long chain, big agriculture, big food systems are really designed to maximize profit at the expense of anything else that is impeding profit. The alternative food system tends to run on a more people, planet, and profit model. So the ecosystems, worker welfare, animal welfare are all prioritized equally. So with the big agriculture, long food supply chains, we have vertically integrated industries that are extremely efficient, but come with a lot of what we call externalities. So they are degrading the environment, degrading our waterways and our soil with chemical fertilizers and pesticides. They're just trying to really increase yield. Often that yield comes at the expense of flavor, of nutrition. So they're selecting foods or crop varieties, I should say, that are really for ease of harvest. They don't grow as tall. They don't topple over. They probably have much less biodiversity and less flavor and nutrition. So you're getting a loss on the environmental front, on the taste front. And often, these very large meat and poultry production facilities, these CAFOs, confined animal feed operations, and mega poultry farms, they're contracting with small farmers in contracts that are very opaque and very exploitative. So workers or little farm owners enter into what are very exploitative, sort of debt peonage kind of relationships with the big conglomerates. So on so many levels, it's not an equitable system. It's not good for us. It's not good for our health. There's a study that found that the cost of the global food system is put at about $12 trillion a year. And that comes in the form of ecosystems degradation and also the cost to human health of eating this way, which is highly processed, not very much variety, not that much nutrition. So that's a big cost that we're paying for these efficiencies and what is actually very cheap food. And so that's what keeps us sort of going to the trough of big food is it's cheap, it's not nutritious, and it's extractive. So the women in my book are really trying to fight back against that and say, no, we deserve better. The planet deserves better. Animals deserve better. It's just better for everyone.
I mean, you cover so many inspiring people in the book with, a really different take on doing things. And they're not just doing things in the way that it's always been done, or they are perhaps, but not in the way that it's been done in maybe perhaps modern history. And I wondered if you could bear in mind that this, a lot of listeners are going to be involved in horticulture or growing. Are there one or two sort of standout people that are working in those arenas that you think are really shining examples?
Well, I think from the horticultural standpoint, one of the chapters that maybe interfaces most with your listenership is the final chapter on seed saving. And I know in the UK, there are many wonderful seed keeping, seed saving organizations. In my final chapter, I really focus on diasporic women and Indigenous women who are very invested in finding the seeds that go back to their native culture. So I talk about a woman named Kristen Leach, who is a Korean adoptee, grew up on Long Island in New York with her adoptive family, which was Caucasian, didn't know anything about her, her cultural foods until she moved across the country and got involved in farming. She found an Asian seed catalog, and this whole world opened up. She ended up teaming up with 3 Korean brothers who run a wonderful restaurant group. And she became their farmer because she was wonderful at farming. She was very skilled. She understood seed keeping and seed saving. And then this led her to found this organization called Second Generation Seed, which really tries to identify these culturally relevant foods, not just for Asians, but all different immigrant diasporic populations in the United States. And it's encouraging people to connect with their ancestral foods, to preserve them. And I heard really interesting stories, like one woman whose roots are in Gujarat, India, and Pakistan. Having really grown up in the United States, she did not know the taste of her native tomato, for example. So she went to the farmers market in the San Francisco area that has the biggest South Asian population. And she began trialing or taste testing different tomato varieties with these Indian aunties who could tell her this is the kind of bitterness or the bittersweet quality that we want in a tomato. And then she grew out these seeds, she stabilized them. They are, open pollinated, so they're going to grow true to type every generation, and they're not patented like the hybrids of big seed, which won't grow true to type. So every year you have to purchase the seed. So it's all about democratizing food and seeds, and it's about preserving culturally relevant foods. And just some of the stories, because often it involves war, being displaced because you're driven out of your country by unrest. We'll increasingly be seeing climate change refugees. And so I think this idea of seed saving and really hanging on to culturally relevant foods will become increasingly important as people are moving all over the globe in a period of real unrest and increasing climate disasters.
And that's actually fascinating, because you wrote in the book about somebody who was growing perilla and they didn't have something to benchmark the taste against. And I hadn't even considered
Right.
it. I mean, we grow perilla here, and I just never thought, well, maybe that's not what it should taste like or how it tasted originally. It's just, there's so much to consider.
It is. And it's interesting, like with perilla, I'm Japanese American, and our perilla is very different from Korean perilla. So again, you have to have those ancestors who are going to be able to tell you this is what it tasted back in the home, like in the home country. If you didn't grow up with that, but still want to hang on to those and have people cooking with these ingredients. So yeah, very true.
And I think that actually brings me on to another question that I had, which was, the producers that you talk about in the book seem to have, for the most part, a very good understanding of the end product that's going to be created with what they produce. Do you think that's a key thing to this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I really try to focus on in the book is to show that it's not just about the farmer or the rancher or the fisher, but it is about creating an entire supply chain. So it's about the miller, the niche meat processor, the organic vegetable hauler and distributor, who's going to connect that small organic grower to the end market, to that restaurant in the big city who prizes heirloom and organically grown vegetables. So unless you have that entire supply chain built and in place, you're not getting that kind of adequate distribution in that last mile, getting your beautiful organically grown vegetables to the right end user. And I talk about the importance of chefs also in explaining to their diners why they want to source from this particular farm or have it grown in this particular way. So I do think the end product, I also talk a lot about value added products, because when you are trying to decommoditize a food, whether it's coffee or chocolate, most of what is produced goes into the commodity market. And these are just bulk purchases that go for a very low price that aren't going to be sustainable for the farmer growing it. So if you want to really give that farmer a living wage and let these small cooperatives prosper, you have to have a superior product that is has certain growing protocols and growing practices. And you have to have it very transparent so people at the end of the supply chain understand they're getting a superior product, whether it's a single origin, whether it's an heirloom variety, whether the bean to bar chocolate maker is doing, things in the best possible way. So a lot of it is educating the consumer why you're paying a little bit more for this bean to bar heirloom chocolate and why it's worth it, because you're really supporting everyone along this short supply chain. So there's a lot of education that goes on. There's a lot of really thinking about what is best for ecosystem restoration and how you're going to pass on this messaging to everyone at the end. So the purpose of my book is really to show everyone who reads it that wherever you live, you have access to these alternative supply chains and producers who are thinking about people and planet and the environment. You just have to maybe do a little looking around, do a little research, and get away from that giant supermarket that you've been going to and look for the farmer's market, the consumer-supported agriculture. It's a whole process that people go through to sort of awaken to what's going on in the food system.
Yeah, well, actually, I think that one of the other unique features of these structures is that they do produce higher quality produce, but sometimes that can actually be as affordable, if not more so, than the long supply chain manufactured things. But they also seem to have like a lot of plates spinning. So not only are they thinking about the end consumer, like you said, they're thinking about the employers. Sometimes they're thinking about how they can deliver their produce affordably to people. And there's this whole social element of the structure that seems to be missing. So although they're short supply chains, it's more of a top to bottom overview of how these things can work in society as a whole, rather than just how much money can we make out of this.
Right. It's a whole systems thinking point of view. And I think two things that are important to point out about these alt food systems is, one, there's a lot of ecosystems restoration going on. So these producers are thinking about building up soil matter. They're thinking about cleaning waterways. They're thinking about creating pollinator borders. All of these things are bringing back biodiversity to the land, which everyone agrees we need to do to be as climate resilient as possible going into a very uncertain climate future. But they're also really not being compensated for all of these ecosystem services the way that big food and big agriculture made huge profits by stripping all these things and by not growing sustainably. They could do it more cheaply because they weren't thinking about how are we giving back to the land and to nature. So that's one obstacle that's facing these. But then on the other side of the ledger, one of the wonderful and beautiful things about these alt food supply chains is that they're revitalizing communities, often rural communities that have been hollowed out by industrialization and by local mills and meat processing plants and local dairies disappearing because of the corporate consolidation of our food system. So there's an incredible level of joy in connecting to the local community and the region, and people really feeling pride and ownership in having delicious food that is grown locally. And we also can't forget that in times of war and pandemic and a lot of global geopolitical uncertainty, the importance of having a local food supply chain is also a matter of national security. Just the way people were growing victory gardens during World War II, it's like we have to feed ourselves. The whole idea of having a garden in your backyard, and if you can't have that, the next best thing is connecting to your local farmers market and your local food producers. So there is this national security, there is this real joy in building community. And I also talk about knowledge networks in our digitally connected age. One of the wonderful things is I talk about these wonderful whole grain bakers here in Toronto, in Ontario, where I live, and how they are very tight with some UK bakers who are really completely on the same page about getting regional whole grains that are milled locally and baking incredible things with them. And the difference in taste alone is enough to really convert people to the alternative food system. But that sense of community across borders and across oceans is also, I think, a really exciting thing about these alternative food systems. And we need to support them and grow them. So I recently started a Substack called Reaping, where I'm trying to keep telling the stories of this growing, interconnected, systems-based thinking approach to food. And I do think it's a way to really be much more prepared for the future in so many different ways.
I could not read those chapters on whole grain baked foods without feeling very hungry at the end of them. And yes,
Yeah.
you're right. They do connect up with someone in the UK who I'm now going to have to go away and do some more research. Is her name Dawn?
Yes, Dawn Woodward, Carol Ferrari are here in Toronto. And I was in London recently, and Dawn recommended Quince Bakery and Eric's. Quince was closed, but I did go to Eric's. Wonderful, whole grain, very much about, I think they were advertising a local CSA and talking about local farms. So very much on the same page in the kind of food system that they're promoting.
I'm definitely going to have to seek some of those out. You said about, there's the element of joy that they bring to the communities and that social kind of structure building that happens behind the scenes. And that can be very difficult to quantify. And I think that sometimes, if I'm right in saying, causes problems for these types of growers and producers.
Yes, I mean, it makes it very challenging because these are intangibles, including the wonderful community building, the revitalization of rural communities, and also the ecosystems restoration services that these women are performing for us. And so there's a lot of education that's involved and a lot of, helping people understand that it's a whole kind of way of thinking that they are supporting. And again, for people to just realize that wherever they live, they can plug into these alt food systems and support a more climate-friendly and resilient way of growing food.
That sort of quantification of elements of the business, I guessed that might be a problem if you were doing things like applying for grants or trying to fit into a particular, reward system. What I didn't realise was quite how much Indigenous people and people of colour had struggled in the past, how much the system was stacked against them. I found that very shocking, to be honest with you. How has that affected land ownership and the ability to work as a business historically?
This is a uniquely American phenomenon because of the 250-year history of slavery, where you had a group of highly skilled agriculturalists who were growing cotton and rice and incredible agricultural knowledge. And then with the Civil War, ostensibly getting land, but then having it quickly taken away from them because of Jim Crow laws, which were instituted as basically another form of keeping African-American farmers into this sort of chattel slavery type of situation where you're a sharecropper. And so there was decades of systematic racism wherein these farmers were completely excluded from all forms of federal agricultural support. So crop subsidies, loans, technical assistance. And so the reason I start my book, chapter 1, is all about Southern African-American agricultural cooperatives and mutual aid societies. And I also talk about my own Japanese-American family's history of being imprisoned during World War II. We looked like the enemy. And even though there was never any sorts of, sabotage or anything proven among these immigrant populations, 120,000 people were put in prison camps. And so both in the African-American community and in this imprisoned Japanese community, cooperatives were a huge source of strength. And the reason I start the chapter with this is because there are direct parallels with the women of the alt food system. It's a truly David and Goliath situation when you think about the the strength, the size, and even if you just looked at the sheer lobbying power of big agriculture and big food, it's just so mismatched. And so how do you aggregate strength and move forward when you are completely disenfranchised and cut off from sort of the typical means of federal support? You have to look to each other. There was at one point the Association of Southern Agricultural Cooperatives that I write about in the South. They collectively presided over 1 million acres of farmland. Much of this was lost because of structural racism, but they were able to aggregate strength, pool money, help each other buy land, give each other equipment loans, crop loans, all kinds of insurance protection. And in the same way, in these prison camps, the one that my father was in that had 11,000 prisoners, they created what became the second largest consumer co-op in the United States, and they were behind barbed wire, completely employee run. But both great examples of how the help has to come from each other and sort of from a grassroots on up. And it is possible. So this is one reason I write about a number of different cooperative enterprises, because again, people are trying to do something that's quite counter to the sort of the standard way of corporate top-down run agriculture. So it is very hard, but there are ways to make it work. And I wanted to show that in that first chapter.
It is hard, but reading the stories of some of the people, they are really having to constantly think on their feet. They're battling with the weather, they're battling with legislation, things outside their control. They're also juggling people and personalities. So it's, although a lot of people are making a great success of it and they really do have inspirational stories, it's not to downplay the kind of challenges of it. Did you ever get the sense that some people try to focus on the societal gains and the kind of good points, and does sometimes profit get overlooked in favor of that?
Yes, and I think that's why I really wanted to show kind of an unvarnished picture of how hard this work actually is. I talk about this phenomenon called the Valley of Death, where you're starting, say, an organic or a systems point of holistic kind of farm, and you're trying to restore ecosystems, pay people living wages. It takes a while for profitability to come because you have upfront investments. And how do you bridge that gap? And so I talk about different ingenious funding schemes or organizations that are helping people who are doing regenerative agriculture get off the ground. But I don't want to sugarcoat how hard it is, because it is incredibly hard to get to that point of profitability. So I wanted to show both the challenges, and I think the small women grazing dairy chapter is a really good illustration of how difficult this work can be and how mutual support. I was able to plug into a really wonderful small women dairy support group, and they were very honest about the hardships that they were going through, both economically and personally. But then I also wanted to show people who really made amazing successes. There's an organic farm in California called Full Belly, been in existence for going on 40 years, super, super diversified, like 80 different varieties of produce, value-added products, a whole range of livestock operation. They have a huge festival every year that is a celebration of organic farming and sort of a wonderful communal, I call it like the Woodstock of agriculture, because I don't know, thousands and thousands of people come to the farm, they camp out, they have a really joyful time. So there are people who have been doing this regenerative and organic farming that are making it. And I wanted to show that it is possible, but also how hard it is. Also, a women-run vegetable distribution company that's been in existence about the same length of time, and how they've managed to grow against all odds and have a completely green trucking fleet and are very women-led. So the stories are inspiring, but I also didn't want to cover up how hard it is and how these people really are heroes and they deserve our support.
Yeah, and I liked the way as well that you acknowledged, and so did some of the people that you spoke to, acknowledged that actually it's going to take a few different ways of doing things. There is not one correct way, but it'll be a balance between different ways of growing and producing. Do you think that that hybrid approach and that ability to adapt is going to be essential moving forward, given everything that we're facing with the climate and supply chains and just the unknowns of life today?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think it's going to take all different forms of farming, all different sizes of farms. And I think it's going to, all of the technology that is coming out. AI is a huge thing in agriculture now. And I'm not against this at all. I think really when we think about climate change, it's an all hands on deck situation. So if you're a big farmer, a lot of them are going towards much more regenerative methods because it works, first of all, and it's saving a huge amount of money. If you don't have chemical inputs and you have fertilizers that are being held up because of the Russia-Ukraine war or are super expensive because of tariffs, it makes sense to just start doing cover cropping, crop rotation, and really adopting some of these age-old practices that we know work. So I see it sort of like, big and small, sort of going into a place where they're sharing a lot of practices that we know work and that are much better for the planet. And also incorporating the latest farming knowledge and agroecological techniques. I think all of that is going to be very important. And I don't want it to be just as, small artisanal is beautiful. And that's not at all the message of my book. It's that we need all different sizes of farms. And we just have to keep thinking about what our priorities are and really also think about ecosystems and biodiversity and think about the workers who are doing the hard work of growing the food and picking the food and harvesting.
Thank you very much to Nancy for a brilliant conversation and book, and thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 263, Ooooby, Out of Our Own Backyard, and episode 338, Real Organic versus Regenerative Farming. rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.